The night he tried to save a dying horse. He had no idea it would save him back. On a frozen mountain night, a reclusive old man stumbled upon a wounded horse family lying in the snow, helpless, hunted, and moments from death. He thought he was rescuing them. He didn't know their arrival would drag him back into the world he'd abandoned and force him to face the fire he'd been running from for 15 years. The morning light crept over the Bighorn Mountains, the way an old man rises from bed, slow, reluctant, almost apologetic. Elias Brannock had already been awake for an hour. He always woke before the sun, not because he needed to, but because silence had become the only rhythm he trusted. Inside his mountain cabin, the wood stove glowed faintly, throwing a thin line of warmth across the room. Outside, winter held the land in a quiet grip, the kind that swallowed sound and memory alike. Elias pushed the door open with a shoulder hardened by years of chopping logs and working alone. The cold met him instantly, crisp enough to sting the lungs, the kind of cold that used to make him feel alive before life took too much from him to measure. The sky was pale blue, stretched thin over the peaks as if painted by a tired hand. Snow covered everything: the trees, the frozen creek, the forgotten trail leading down into the valley where the world continued without him. He walked toward the edge of the clearing, boots sinking into powder. The air smelled of pine and stillness, that rare kind of mountain peace people in cities paid high real estate prices to experience for a single weekend. Elias had once insured homes, cabins, and ranches when he worked down in Sheridan, a life that felt like it belonged to another man entirely. Now, he barely remembered what it was like to talk to another human being for more than a few minutes at a time. The only sound was his breath fogging in front of him. Even the woods seemed to be holding theirs. Winter mornings in the high country had a way of making everything feel suspended, as if the world had paused mid-thought. Elias liked that. It meant nothing demanded anything of him. But that morning, something was different. A faint noise, barely a thread of sound, slipped through the trees. Elias straightened, head tilted. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch breaking under a deer's weight. It was softer, strained, almost swallowed by the cold. A sound of effort. A sound of pain. He waited, holding the breath that came next. Then he heard it again. Low, uneven, like a creature pushing against its last ounce of strength. Elias glanced toward the timberline. 15 years of living alone had taught him many kinds of quiet. This was not one of them. This was the kind that warned something was wrong, something alive, something close. He walked toward the sound, weaving through lodgepole pines that stood frozen in time. Snowflakes drifted gently from their branches as he passed. The noise came, again, a little clearer this time. Elias paused beside a fallen tree, listening. Another sound joined it, higher pitched, trembling, almost like a small animal calling out in confusion. Elias's brows pulled together. The mountains hid many secrets, but this felt unusual, even for them. He stepped deeper into the trees. His boots disappeared halfway to the ankle with every stride. The temperature dipped further, the air thinning into something sharp enough to cut. He moved carefully, the way someone who had survived too much learns to move, slow, steady, expecting nothing but prepared for everything. Then the trees opened into a small clearing he hadn't stepped into in years. and he saw them. At first, his mind didn't match the shapes correctly. A mound of brown and gray against the white. A leg twisted in a way no living creature should accept. A flank rising and falling with the weak rhythm of breath. Then the colors separated, and the forms sharpened. A horse, large, powerful once, now lying on its side, breath steaming in thin, broken bursts. Beside him, a mare with a deep gash along her shoulder, blood already darkening in the cold. And tucked against her, shivering uncontrollably, two foals pressed so close their small bodies seemed almost woven together. Elias's breath caught, not from fear, but from something older, deeper, buried under years of trying not to feel. The stallion's eyes flicked toward him, dull with exhaustion, but alert enough to recognize a stranger. The mare tried to stand, managed only a trembling shift. One of the foals gave a tiny sound. Not a cry, just the smallest question life could ask. Elias stepped forward slowly, palms open, the way he did decades ago, when calming spooked cattle on volunteer days. The horses didn't move, not because they trusted him, but because they were too far gone to do anything else. He knelt beside the mare. The wound was clean but deep, the kind left by something sharp. A post, a fallen branch, or, he saw it then, tracks in the snow, man-made, boot prints, heavy, purposeful, a faint drag mark, and near the edge of the clearing, almost buried in white, a small brass casing glinting like a secret left behind. Not an accident. Not a fall. Something else. Something human. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. 15 years he had kept to himself. 15 years telling the world to pass him by. He wasn't supposed to be here. Wasn't supposed to care. But when he opened his eyes again, the mare looked at him. Really looked at him. Her dark gaze steady. Tired. Accepting. And Elias felt something shift inside him, a subtle crack in the ice that had kept him numb for so long. The foals pressed closer to their mother, tiny breaths clouding the frozen air. The stallion's chest lifted once more, then again, barely. Elias exhaled slowly. The mountains had always demanded honesty, even from a man who'd tried to bury every truth he carried. And the truth was simple. If he walked away now, they would not survive the hour. He rose to his feet, snow brushing off his coat, and the words slipped out of him in a voice that hadn't been used for comfort in years. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you now." And for the first time, in a long, long while, he meant it. "I've got you now," Elias whispered, though the words seemed too small for what lay in front of him. The mare's breath rose in thin ribbons that disappeared as quickly as they formed. The foals pressed their faces into her flank, their bodies shivering in short, desperate tremors. Elias scanned the clearing once more, making sure nothing else stirred in the trees. Then he knelt beside the stallion. The animal's coat was a deep chestnut beneath the frost, but its warmth was fading. Elias rested a hand gently on its neck. The stallion didn't move, not even a flick of an ear. Only the faintest rise of its ribs pushed against Elias's palm. It had fought hard. Harder than most creatures could. There was dignity in that kind of struggle, the kind men in cities rarely understood, even with all the mountain safety guides and outdoor insurance policies the world offered. Some battles simply couldn't be prevented. A soft grunt behind him pulled Elias back to the living. The mare attempted to stand again, but her legs buckled immediately. Elias moved to steady her, speaking softly, not words meant to soothe, but words meant to connect. "Easy, girl. I see you're trying." The mare blinked slowly, her lashes catching bits of snow. Something in her eyes reminded him of a woman he once knew. Quiet, strong, always holding more weight than others could see. The foal closest to him, a small, pale colt, tucked its legs under its body as if trying to disappear into the mare's shadow. The other, slightly larger with a reddish coat, took a hesitant step toward Elias. Its legs wobbled like green branches in a storm, but curiosity was a powerful instinct. It sniffed the air, ears twitching, eyes wide in the colorless morning. "That's right," he murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." He followed the tracks in the snow with his gaze. They weren't scattered like the prints of predators, nor frantic like fleeing prey. They were straight, deliberate, made by boots that belonged to men who walked with purpose. They circled the clearing in a way that felt too practiced, as if someone had been pushing the horses, driving them somewhere they didn't want to go. Closer to the tree line, Elias spotted another brass casing gleaming faintly beneath snowmelt. Not old, not rusted, maybe no more than a day out here. He didn't touch it, just noted its place in the pattern. Whoever fired that shot had aimed to wound, not kill, at least not right away. "Damn," he whispered under his breath, not as a curse, but as an acknowledgement of something grim. He took a step backward, assessing the scene like he used to assess fire lines, checking wind, slope, every variable that determined survival. Moving the horses would take time, and strength he wasn't sure he still had. The trail back to his cabin wound between thick trees and uneven slopes, a mile that felt longer in snow this deep. But leaving them here would mean surrendering them to cold, hunger, or whatever men had done this. The mare's breathing hitched, not in pain, but in fear. Her ears flicking toward a distant sound Elias didn't hear at first. Then it reached him, the groan of trees shifting under frost, a low rumble in the gut of the forest. The weather was turning. The sky, once a pale blue smear, darkened toward the west. He didn't have time. "All right," he said aloud, more to himself than to the horses. "We move now." The chestnut stallion lifted its head weakly, meeting Elias's gaze for a moment. Something passed between them, not gratitude or fear, but a simple recognition, as if the animal understood the decision being made. The stallion exhaled once, a long, soft breath that drifted upward like a final offering, and then its body settled into stillness. Elias bowed his head. "Rest easy," he murmured. Then he turned to the living again. He wrapped his arms around the mare's chest, feeling her tremble beneath his grip. "Help me out, girl," he whispered. With a groan, she pushed with her hind legs, and together they managed to shift her enough that she could brace herself. Slowly, painfully, she rose, not fully steady, but upright. The larger foal pressed against her immediately, finding reassurance in the shape of her body. The smaller one remained curled in the snow. Elias knelt beside the pale colt. It was smaller than he thought. Too small for this cold, too fragile for any world touched by cruelty. When he lifted it, its body felt limp in places it shouldn't. The colt didn't cry out, didn't resist. That frightened him more than any sound would have. "You stay with me," he muttered. "You hear? You stay." He wrapped his coat around the foal, holding it tightly against his chest. Its heartbeat pulsed weakly under his arm, like a flickering ember. Elias stood, gesturing for the mare to follow. She took a hesitant step, then another, leaning heavily on her uninjured side. The larger foal followed instinctively, sticking so close to her that its nose brushed her flank. The forest swallowed them slowly as they moved, the trees standing like silent guardians. Each step broke through the snow with a muffled crunch. Elias felt the cold seeping into his gloves, biting through layers of wool. The mountains demanded effort for every inch gained, but Elias had lived with these demands long enough to understand their rhythm. Halfway back to the cabin, the pale foal stirred weakly against him, its breath warming the inside of his coat. Elias tightened his hold, careful not to jostle it. The mare limped behind him, her breath quickening. He glanced back often, watching her ears flick, her eyes scan every shadow. She was fighting for her young, with a resolve that reminded him of everything he once believed about the world. That life, no matter how bruised, always reached for something beyond itself. As the cabin came into view at the edge of the clearing, Elias exhaled for the first time in minutes. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin ribbon, his only companion in long winters. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, ushering the mare inside the barn-like extension he had added years ago. The larger foal trotted in beside her. Elias set the pale colt down gently onto a bed of straw near the stove's warmth. It blinked slowly, its breathing shallow but steady. The mare lowered her head, nuzzling both foals in turn. Elias watched the scene in silence, feeling something shift inside his ribcage, a slow, steady thaw. The storm outside deepened, wind brushing the cabin walls with long, cold fingers. Whatever had happened in that clearing had been only the beginning, and Elias knew, with a certainty he hadn't felt in years, that the snow had been hiding more than wounded horses. It had been hiding the first crack in a life he'd spent too long trying to seal shut. The cabin had never felt small to Elias before. In 15 long winters, it had held nothing but him, the crackle of the stove, and the steady hum of wind through timber walls. But with the injured mare resting near the warmest corner, the stronger foal curled against her side, and the pale colt lying in a nest of blankets at Elias's feet, the room felt unexpectedly full of breath, full of presence, full of something that tugged gently at the quiet he had lived inside for so long. Elias knelt beside the pale colt and placed 2 fingers lightly under its jaw. A faint pulse flickered against his touch. Not steady, not strong, but there. The colt's coat, cream with thin streaks of gray, was still damp from the snow, even though Elias had rubbed it dry as best he could. It shivered, its small ribs rising and falling like the fragile bellows of a fading fire. "Hang on, little one," he whispered, adjusting the blanket around its body. "You've made it this far." The mare, Willow, though he hadn't given her a name yet, watched him with dark, steady eyes. She lay with her injured shoulder angled away from the floor, her breath deeper now that warmth had reached her bones. When the larger foal nudged her for comfort, she shifted slightly, gathering the young closer with a soft rumble in her throat. Elias couldn't remember the last time a sound that gentle had filled this place. He moved to the stove to stir the pot of warm water he'd set earlier. Steam rose in thin threads, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and the faint minerals of mountain well water. The air felt different in here now, not just warmer, but alive in a way the cabin hadn't felt since a time he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He dipped a clean cloth into the water and wrung it out, letting it cool just enough before returning to the mare's side. She flinched when he touched her wound, but only slightly. Elias murmured soft reassurances, the words coming more naturally than he expected. He cleaned the dried blood, examined the edges of the gash, and felt a dull ache in his chest at the thought of how she had been hurt. Snowmelt had washed away much of the evidence, but he hadn't forgotten the brass casing in the clearing, the one hint that humans had a hand in this. When he finished tending to the mare, he crouched beside the larger foal. It blinked up at him with eyes too big for its face, eyes that held the same blend of fear and trust he'd seen earlier in the clearing. Elias placed a hand gently along its neck, feeling the warmth beneath its thin winter coat. "You're stronger than you look," he murmured. The foal leaned into the touch for a brief moment, just long enough to surprise him, then returned to nuzzling its mother. But it was the pale colt that drew his attention back every few seconds. It lay motionless except for the rise and fall of breath, its ears twitching faintly as if listening to something far away. Elias lifted it again, holding its fragile body against his chest. The little head sagged onto his arm. He could feel the soft flutter of its breath. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the weight of that small life in his hands. Something inside him, something that hadn't risen in years, stirred. He didn't try to name it. Naming things made them real, and real things had a way of hurting. He pulled a wooden stool close to the stove and sat with the colt in his arms. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing upward behind the iron grate. Shadows climbed the log walls like memories he tried hard not to remember. He glanced at the corner where he used to keep 2 pairs of boots by the door, before life had taught him what loss could take. The fire snapped loudly, breaking his thoughts. Elias exhaled and turned his focus back to the colt. Its breathing had evened out a little, still shallow, but no longer erratic. That tiny change settled into him like a warm ember. Time slipped by quietly. The storm outside thickened, wind brushing flakes of snow against the windows like soft fingers tapping for attention. Inside, the only movements were small. Willow shifting her weight, the reddish foal stretching its stiff legs, the pale colt stirring weakly in Elias's arms. He finally set the colt down again, arranging the blankets with a gentleness that didn't match his rough, mountain-worn hands. Then he stood and poured a small bowl of warm water, placing it near Willow. She sniffed it, hesitated, then drank. The faint sound of her tongue lapping at the water felt like a victory. Elias stepped back, leaning against the table, watching the 3 of them breathe in the soft glow of the stove. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel like a shelter built to keep the world out. It felt like a place meant to protect something fragile inside it. His eyes drifted to the shelves where he kept supplies: medical salve, bandages, a few leftover antibiotics from an old visit to a vet in Sheridan back when he still spoke to other people. He grabbed the tin of salve and crouched again to check the mare's wound one more time. "You've got fight in you," he said softly. "That'll help." Willow shifted, lowering her head to sniff his sleeve. A simple gesture, but it rooted something in his chest, a connection he hadn't invited but now couldn't ignore. The larger foal nudged his arm gently, and he let his hand rest on its muzzle. Its breath warmed his palm, carrying a faint sweetness that reminded him of hay and young growth in spring. The pale colt gave a small, almost imperceptible whimper. Elias immediately moved to lift it again, cradling it close. He pressed his cheek lightly to its soft coat, feeling how cold it still was despite the blankets. "Stay with me," he whispered. "You're not going anywhere tonight." Something unexpected tightened in his throat, It felt like the first real emotion he'd allowed himself to feel in longer than he cared to count. He wished he could tell himself this was temporary, that once the storm passed and the animals recovered, he'd return to his quiet routine. But the truth settled over him like the weight of snow on branches. Nothing about this night was temporary. These animals had arrived like a crack in the life he'd built, letting in a sliver of something he'd long sealed away. The wind howled faintly outside, rattling the cabin eaves. But inside, the fire glowed brighter, casting soft gold across the small bodies gathered near it. Elias held the pale colt closer, the warmth of the stove brushing his face as he whispered to no one, to everyone, to the fragile hope breathing in his arms. "You're home for now, and I'll look after you." He didn't know yet that those words would change everything, far more than the storm, far more than the mountains, far more than the quiet he'd lived in for 15 years. He only knew that the cabin, for the first time in a long time, did not feel empty. By the time dawn bled into the sky, a thin ribbon of gold cutting through the gray, Elias had not slept. He sat slumped on the stool beside the stove, elbows on his knees, the pale colt wrapped in his coat and resting against his chest. The fire had burned low. The cabin smelled of warm hay, smoke, and the quiet breath of living creatures, the kind of smell Elias used to associate with safety, before the world had taught him that safety was sometimes just the moment before everything changed. The mare dozed lightly near the wall, her injured shoulder rising and falling in slow rhythm. The stronger foal slept soundly, curled against her belly, and Sprig, the pale colt, though he still hadn't named it, rested against Elias with its small head tucked under his chin. Every few minutes, the tiny body twitched as if dreaming, then settled again. Elias watched the flames shift and reshape, their orange glow flickering along the cabin walls. Fire used to be his life, fighting it, surviving it, losing everything to it. Even now, something in the crackle of burning wood made his chest tighten with memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. A woman's laugh, a boy's small hand gripping his sleeve, the roar of a wildfire turning the horizon into a wall of living heat. Too much lost. Too much burned. The colt stirred, nudging closer. Elias straightened slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Easy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he meant the colt or himself. He carefully set the small creature back onto the blankets. Its breath puffed in faint clouds, but its heartbeat felt stronger than the night before. He placed another folded quilt beside it, creating a small wall to keep in as much warmth as possible. A simple gesture, yet it held a weight he hadn't felt in years, the weight of responsibility, the weight of caring. He stood and stretched, his back popping from too many hours hunched over. The cold from the floor seeped into his bones despite the stove's warmth. He moved toward the cupboard, pulling out the last jar of broth he'd canned the previous autumn. It wasn't meant for animals. It wasn't much meant for him either. But it was nourishment, and something inside him insisted that might matter today. The mare lifted her head as Elias approached. Her dark eyes followed his movements with quiet intelligence, not fear. She seemed to understand his intentions even before he knelt beside her. "You fought hard out there," he murmured, brushing his fingers gently along her neck. Let's help you keep fighting." He dipped his hand into the warm broth and held it near her muzzle. She sniffed it carefully, then lapped it slowly. The simple act made Elias exhale, a tightness in his chest releasing just a little. The foal beside her raised its head, curious, then leaned against its mother sleepily. For a moment, watching them, the cabin felt suspended between two worlds, the one he had tried to leave behind, and the one that had unexpectedly found him again. He stood and glanced toward the window. Outside, the world was a washed-out white. Snowflakes drifted lazily, unbothered by the storm that had passed through the night. The forest looked peaceful again, but Elias knew better. Peace was often a thin layer over something deeper, something waiting. He walked to the door and opened it just enough to feel the air. Cold, but quiet. No tracks except his own from the day before. He closed the door slowly, letting the latch settle with a soft click. Whatever men had done this to the horses, they were not here now. But they had been, and that meant they might return. He didn't want to think about it yet. Instead, he returned to the pale colt. It lay still, but not limp anymore. Its ears twitched when he approached, and its eyes fluttered open. Blue-gray, cloudy, but aware. Elias knelt, placing a hand gently over its side. "There you are," he murmured. "Still with me?" The colt blinked slowly, its breath brushing against his wrist. The softness of it struck him harder than he expected. He'd forgotten how fragile new life could feel, how hopeful, how dangerous. He remembered holding his own son like this once. Sam, barely a week old, tiny fists curled against his chest. He remembered the way Sam had rested his head under Elias's chin, just as the colt had done hours earlier. There had been warmth then, laughter, the smell of soap and pine, a woman humming softly in the next room. Then fire, smoke, sirens, and a silence that swallowed every memory, leaving only the ache behind. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Not now, he thought. The past wasn't going anywhere. But these animals, they needed him now. And he found, surprisingly, that he needed them too. The mare shifted, giving a soft whinny that barely broke the quiet. The larger foal stirred and rose unsteadily to its legs, shaking out its mane. It looked almost normal in the warm cabin light, almost like a creature who had not been running for its life only hours before. Elias watched its small, stumbling steps, an involuntary smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You'll be all right," he said softly. "Both of you." Then he glanced again at the pale colt. All three. He didn't know when he had last spoken so many words aloud. As he stood, a sudden gust rattled the window. The mare's ears flicked toward the sound, her muscles tensing. Elias crossed the room quickly and looked outside. The sky was darker than it should be at mid-morning. Clouds thickened along the ridge, heavy with another storm. Or maybe just the long breath of winter finding its shape again. "Not today," Elias muttered. "Give us time." He turned away from the window and looked around the cabin, at the sleeping foals, the injured mare, the blankets gathered near the stove, the small signs of life warming the air. It struck him then how much the room had changed since yesterday, and how much he had changed with it. 15 years he had lived here without expecting anything from the world, without caring whether the world expected anything from him. But standing there, surrounded by the quiet breaths of the animals he'd pulled back from the edge, Elias felt the faintest flicker of something he had buried deeply. The instinct to protect, to heal, to stand between the vulnerable and the harshness waiting outside. He wasn't sure he was ready for it. He wasn't sure he deserved it. But the cabin, once hollow, now pulsed with life. And Elias Brannock, who had once stopped caring about anything at all, felt something shift inside him. Subtle, but undeniable. He reached down to adjust the blanket around the pale colt once more, letting his hand rest gently along its back. "You're safe here," he said quietly. And for the first time in years, he almost believed it. The storm weakened by mid-afternoon, leaving the world coated in a thick stillness that felt heavier than snow itself. Elias stepped outside to gather more firewood, his breath settling into the cold air in soft clouds. Behind him, the cabin door remained open just wide enough for him to hear the soft rustling inside. Willow shifting, the stronger foal pacing with small, uncertain steps, and the pale colt letting out occasional faint, dreamy sounds. They were alive, for now, but survival was never guaranteed in a place like this. He crossed the clearing and bent to pick up a fallen branch when a shape in the snow caught his eye. Not a branch. A mark. Deep, deliberate, pressed at a downward angle. A boot print. Not his. He straightened slowly, scanning the tree line. Pine needles sagged under the leftover ice, unmoving. No sound except distant melting dripping from branches. But the track was fresh, no more than a day old. He followed it with his eyes across the clearing, where the snow dipped in a strange, unnatural curve. Another step, and then another. Someone else had been here. Elias crouched, brushing his glove lightly across the frozen imprint. The sole pattern was wrong for hikers or ranchers, wrong for hunters too. Too angular. Too narrow. The kind of boot worn by men being paid for their silence, men who worked for other men with deeper pockets and darker motives. He rose, tension stiffening his spine. It had been years since he felt watched, but instinct had a memory longer than reason. He scanned the clearing again, then the path leading toward the ravine. More marks. Not many, but enough to say someone had moved with purpose, circling, watching, tracking. The air felt thinner suddenly, as if the mountain itself had taken a sharp breath. He followed the trail a few steps farther until something glinted near a low shrub. He knelt and reached into the snow, pulling out a small metal fragment. Cold, smooth, unmistakable. A bullet casing. Brass. Clean. Fired recently enough that no rust dared touch it. Elias turned it in his gloved fingers. This wasn't from a ranch hand trying to scare off predators. This was from someone hunting something they intended to claim. Or sell. His jaw tightened. Back in the cabin, Willow lifted her head as he entered, ears pricked at the cold still clinging to his coat. The stronger foal trotted to him, awkward, hopeful, and nudged his hand. He didn't return the gesture right away. The weight of the casing pressed heavily in his palm. "You didn't just stumble into trouble out there," he murmured, staring at Willow. "Someone put you there?" She blinked, her eyes holding something ancient and knowing. Elias tossed the casing onto the table. It clinked against the wood, a sound too sharp for the quiet room. The pale colt stirred at the noise and whimpered, softly. Elias moved quickly, scooping it up, settling it against his chest. He could feel how light the colt still was, how close it had been to slipping away before he'd found it. He held the small body and felt, beneath its fragile breath, a deeper truth settling in his bones. If someone had wanted the horses dead, they would have finished the job. But they hadn't, which meant they wanted them alive, wanted them rounded up, wanted them contained until they could be hauled away. To where? He didn't want to think of the answer, but he knew. Everyone living within 100 miles of these mountains knew the rumors. Trucks without plates spotted on back roads, wild Mustangs disappearing from the plains, whispers about auctions held far from the law's reach. High Plains Stock Company, the locals called the men behind it, though no one said the name without something cold sliding down their spine. Elias set the colt down gently. It blinked up at him, its breath shallow but steadier than it had been this morning. He brushed its mane back and stood. The knocking came so suddenly, he froze. 3 sharp raps on the door. Willow jerked upright, the older foal pressing into her side. Elias moved silently toward the window and peeked out. A woman on horseback sat just beyond the porch steps, bundled tight in a sheriff's jacket lined with gray fur. Her breath billowed from her scarf in controlled, patient bursts. Her posture was steady, not tense. Someone who had been here before. Deputy Marla Pike. Elias opened the door halfway. "Morning," she said, her voice low, careful not to startle whatever she sensed behind him. "You're off your usual path," Elias replied. "Storm blocked the north road," she said. "Figured I'd check on the cabins out this way. Make sure no one froze to death." Her eyes flicked past him, lingering not on him, but on the faint movement in the shadows behind him. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Elias said, quicker than he intended. Her brow lifted. "You don't sound fine." Silence hung between them, stretching into the cold air. Marla was one of the few law officers who still rode these backwoods, one of the few who didn't speak unless she had something worth saying. She looked at him the way a person looks at a ledge they're not sure they trust. "Elias," she said quietly, "there were reports last night." "Of what?" "Shots fired," she replied. "South Ridge. Maybe a mile from your clearing." His chest tightened. "I found tracks," he admitted. "Not mine." Marla exhaled slowly. "I had a feeling. High Plains has men surveying again. Holt's been sniffing around, asking ranchers if they've seen any Mustang herds lately." She paused. "He's got paperwork now. Claims he's rounding up strays for relocation." "Relocation," Elias repeated, bitterness scraping the word hollow. "You and I both know what it really means," she said. Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. Marla shifted in her saddle. "Look, if Holt's men pushed anything off the ridge last night, you need to be careful. They don't take kindly to interference." He didn't move, didn't nod, but his silence told her enough. "You're not alone anymore," she continued softly. "Not up here. Not this time." He swallowed hard. "You should go," he said. "Road's tough in this wind." Marla held his gaze for a moment. Something unspoken passed between them. Respect, maybe, or warning. Then she tugged on the reins, turning her horse toward the trail. "Lock your door, Elias," she said over her shoulder. "Men like Holt don't wait for daylight." The wind swallowed her tracks almost as soon as she made them. Inside, Willow shifted uneasily. The pale colt let out a weak sigh. Elias retrieved the bullet casing from the table and closed his fist around it, feeling its cold edge bite into his palm. Someone had hurt these animals. Someone had driven them into the storm, and someone would be back. He looked at the fragile lives gathered under his roof, at the quiet breaths rising and falling in the warm glow of the stove. If danger was coming for them, it would have to come through him first. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a morning so strangely warm that Elias almost didn't trust it. Sunlight poured over the clearing like a slow, hesitant apology for the days of cold before it. The air smelled different, too. Less like winter, and more like something waking up beneath the frost. Elias stepped outside with a cautious breath, listening to the soft dripping of snow melting from the cabin roof. Behind him, the cabin door creaked slightly as Willow shifted her weight. The mare had rested through the night, and though the wound on her shoulder still made every movement deliberate, there was a new steadiness in her breathing. The stronger foal, Ember, as he caught himself calling it in his mind, stood alert beside her, ears flicking toward the open door, as if waiting for permission to explore the world again. He didn't know when he had started naming them, or why. Maybe because names anchored things, made them less like burdens and more like beings. Maybe because giving something a name meant believing it might survive. The pale colt, Sprig, had made it through another night. Elias still wasn't sure how. At dawn, Sprig lifted its head on its own for the first time, wobbling uncertainly. That tiny effort had hit him harder than he expected. He had carried men out of burning buildings with less relief. Inside the cabin, Sprig shifted again, pushing its nose weakly toward the blanket as if trying to understand the warmth beneath it. Elias crouched and brushed a hand along its side, feeling the tentative rise and fall of its breath. "Easy now," he whispered. "You're figuring it out." Outside, the sunlight strengthened. The air warmed enough that Elias decided the horses could stretch their legs. The mare needed movement to keep her muscles from stiffening, and the foals needed to learn balance again. He dragged open the barn-like extension and stepped into the snow, packing a wide path with his boots. When he returned inside, Willow was already on her feet, swaying slightly but determined. Ember nudged her flank excitedly. Sprig blinked toward the light with slow curiosity, its legs trembling beneath it. Elias slipped his arms around the small colt and lifted gently. Light though Sprig was, the motion still strained his back. But Sprig didn't protest, just rested its head against his shoulder with a breath soft as a feather landing. He carried Sprig to the doorway and set it down on the snow-packed path. The colt tested the ground with uncertain steps, its hooves sinking in shallow indents. Ember bounded forward immediately, darting in clumsy excitement that sent powder flying. Willow followed in slow, careful strides. Elias stepped aside, letting the sun decide what happened next. Ember took the lead. The young foal trotted toward the edge of the clearing, wobbling, stumbling, then righting itself with a burst of determination that made Elias almost smile. Willow watched with quiet patience, occasionally lowering her head to nudge Ember back when it wandered too far. Sprig stayed close to Elias's legs at first, its small body trembling with the effort of staying upright. Then, as Ember circled around again, Sprig took one unsteady step forward, then another. Elias crouched, palms open, ready to steady the fragile creature. But Sprig didn't falter. It willed its legs to move, each step a soft rebellion against whatever had weakened it. A breath caught in Elias's throat as Sprig's first true attempt at walking carried it a few feet away. "That's it," he murmured. "You keep going." He didn't realize how tightly he had been holding himself until his shoulders relaxed. Watching life push itself upward again, delicate, stubborn, hopeful, did something to him he wasn't prepared for. It felt like looking at something he'd believed was lost. Ember trotted back and bumped Sprig gently, as if offering encouragement. The small colt wobbled, but didn't fall. Willow lowered her head and breathed warm air over both of them. For a moment, the clearing felt like a small world made of nothing but breath, sunlight, and the soft push of life moving forward. Elias stepped back, letting the horses fill the open space with their tentative joy. He found himself standing near the cabin door, arms crossed loosely, watching the scene unfold. He didn't realize he had been smiling until the cold air brushed the corners of his mouth. But as he continued to watch, he noticed something else. Footprints. Farther out, near the tree line, half melted but unmistakable. The same angular pattern he had seen near the clearing where he'd found the horses. Not his. Not from an animal. Someone had been here while he slept. He walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing, careful not to startle the horses. The tracks were old enough to blur at the edges, but still clear in pattern. A person had stood here, watching, measuring, waiting. Elias felt his jaw tighten. Behind him, Willow let out a soft, questioning sound. He turned. The mare was watching him, ears tilted forward. Ember stood beside her, alert. Sprig rested, exhausted from its first attempt at movement, but alive. Elias looked from the tracks to the horses and felt something gather inside him. Something small, but solid, like a stone tightening in his fist. The world he had avoided for so long was edging closer to his doorstep. Men with motives darker than winter shadows were circling these hills again. And the animals outside his cabin, learning to walk under the thin spring sunlight, had no way of knowing what hunted them. He moved back slowly, letting the sight of the horses settle his thoughts. Ember bolted across the clearing with a burst of youthful energy. Willow followed with quiet grace. Sprig, tired but determined, took a few shaky steps in their direction before lowering itself into the snow with a small sigh. Elias knelt beside Sprig, brushing snow gently from its back. "You did well," he said softly. "Better than anyone expected." Sprig blinked sleepily. Elias stayed like that for a while, kneeling in snow, one hand resting on the fragile body of a creature just learning to live again, until the wind shifted. The temperature dropped slightly, carrying with it the faintest scent of motor oil, not from his tools, from vehicles. He stood slowly, scanning the tree line again. Nothing moved. But the scent didn't lie. Something, or someone, was drawing closer to the mountains. He gathered the foals, guiding Willow back toward the cabin. Ember trotted ahead. Sprig leaned against him for warmth. As he closed the door behind them, Elias glanced once more at the fading boot prints in the snow. They weren't just passing through. They were scouting. And the family of horses resting on his cabin floor, warming the room with their breath and their fragile faith, were worth something to someone who didn't care whether they lived or died. Elias Brannock took a slow breath and whispered to the quiet room, "I won't let them take you." Inside, the stove crackled. Willow exhaled deeply. Sprig slept. Outside, the wind shifted again. this time carrying the faintest echo of engines in the valley below. Trouble was on its way. The first hint of smoke came long after the sun dipped behind the western ridge. Not a column, not a plume, just a thin thread drifting low through the trees, almost invisible except for the way the moonlight bent around it. Elias smelled it before he saw it, the faint sting curling into the back of his throat. He froze on the porch, one hand resting on the door frame, listening. The mountains had a language. Wind whispered one thing, snow whispered another. But smoke always spoke plainly. It meant something was burning. Behind him, Willow shifted restlessly in the cabin. Ember paced in small circles, letting out soft, anxious grunts. Sprig slept, exhausted from the day's effort, but even in sleep the colt twitched uneasily, as if sensing a change in the air. Elias stepped off the porch and walked toward the tree line. A faint orange glow pulsed far beyond the pines, too low to be lightning, too steady to be the last shreds of twilight. He knelt, ran his fingers through the soil, brought them to his nose. The scent wasn't strong yet, but he recognized the dryness beneath it, the brittle edge of timber warmed too fast. A fire, but not a natural one. There had been no storm, no lightning strike, no broken power line. The snowmelt should have made ignition harder, not easier. This fire was young, deliberate, placed where the wind could carry it along a narrow band of underbrush. A fuse, not an accident. His chest tightened. Someone was pushing heat into the forest, right toward his clearing. Elias stood and scanned the darkness. No movement, no voices. But shadows shifted along the ridge, long and thin, like figures caught between trees. He knew better than to call out. The men who did this sort of thing didn't answer questions. They created smoke to hide the answers. He hurried back into the cabin. The horses reacted instantly. Willow lifted her head, ears pinned forward. Ember pressed into her side. Sprig startled awake with a weak cry. "Easy," Elias murmured, though his own pulse was beginning to rise. He moved quickly, gathering the supplies he would need: blankets, a lantern, a small bag of essentials, the old axe he kept by the stove. His hands moved with the efficient rhythm of a man who'd once lived through nights like this. The horses watched every step. He opened the back door that led to the narrow path behind the cabin. The night air rushed in, cold, sharp, carrying more smoke now. Willow hesitated, nostrils flaring. She knew the scent too. All wild creatures did. Elias placed a hand on her neck. "We're going." He stepped out first, leading them into the darkness. Willow followed, limping but steady. Ember trotted close beside her, glancing nervously over its shoulder. Sprig struggled to climb over the threshold, so Elias scooped the colt into his arms and held it against his chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat fluttering with fear. The air tasted different now, thicker, hotter, like something was waking in the forest. The glow on the ridge brightened, casting long shadows through the trees. Elias moved quickly down the path he had worn across years of solitude, his boots crunching softly over crusted snow. Then he heard them. Engines in the distance. Low, slow, deliberate. Not the frantic roar of firefighters, not the tired rumble of ranch trucks. These engines idled, crept, waited. Holt's men. He quickened his pace, weaving between dense branches. The fire was still far, but the wind was shifting, pulling smoke through the pines like a warning finger. Willow stumbled. Elias paused, letting her regain her footing. She steadied herself with a soft grunt, pressing her nose against Sprig briefly, as if checking the colt still breathed. "You're doing good," Elias whispered. The engines grew closer. He could feel the vibrations now, faint but unmistakable, rolling through the frozen ground like distant footsteps. He turned off the main path, guiding the horses through a narrower break between trees. The clearing ahead was small but hidden, a place he used to sit during summers long gone, when silence had been something he chose, not something he used to hide from the world. But as he approached, a beam of white light cut suddenly through the dark. He dropped to a crouch instantly, pulling Sprig protectively against him. Willow stopped behind him, Ember pressed tightly to her flank. The beam swept lazily through the trees, searching. A voice followed, sharp, flat, familiar in a way that made Elias's stomach twist. "Spread out. They couldn't have gotten far." "Halt." Elias stayed perfectly still, breath shallow, back pressing against the cold earth. He heard footsteps, the crunch of boots, the low hum of men moving with purpose. They weren't searching for a man. They were searching for the animals behind him, creatures whose bodies could be turned into money if captured alive. Willow trembled. Elias put a hand on her neck, steadying her silently. The flashlight beam passed over the trees once more, then moved away. Voices drifted deeper into the forest. Engines rumbled again, repositioning. They were circling. Elias took a slow, steady breath. He had once fought wildfires with only seconds to spare. He had stood between flames and men who trusted him. But tonight, the flames weren't the threat. Not yet. The danger came from men carrying lights that cut through darkness with the precision of hunters. He rose, keeping low, and guided Willow toward the ravine. Sprig whimpered softly. Ember nudged its sibling with a touch of reassurance. Even in fear, they moved as a unit. The ravine narrowed, funneling them toward an opening between two boulders. Elias slid through first, motioning Willow to follow. Her injured shoulder brushed stone, and she flinched but pushed through. Ember squeezed behind her. Sprig trembled in Elias's arms. Just as they passed the gap, the forest behind them lit up. An orange surge filled the night sky, too sudden to be natural. Someone had accelerated the fire. Elias felt heat brush the back of his neck. The air rippled with rising temperature. Holt's voice echoed across the slope. "Drive them down the ridge." Elias's heart hammered once, hard. They weren't just using fire as cover. They were using it as a trap. He couldn't outrun flames carrying the wind behind them. He couldn't outmaneuver men who knew these woods almost as well as he did. But he had one advantage. He knew places on this mountain where no engine could follow. Elias turned left, moving into a narrow cut in the rock, a hidden path he hadn't walked in years. Smoke spilled into the ravine behind them. The fire roared louder, climbing, hungry. Willow limped faster now, driven by instinct. Ember stayed close, matching her steps. Sprig's heartbeat fluttered wildly against Elias's chest. As the fire glow brightened the shadows around them, Elias whispered into the smoky night, "We're not stopping. Not tonight." And for the first time since he'd found them in the snow, the horses didn't just follow him. They trusted him. The narrow cut in the rock funneled Elias and the horses into a shelter of shadow, a place where the moonlight barely touched the ground. Smoke drifted overhead in slow waves, sliding across the night air like a living thing searching for what it had been sent to consume. Elias held Sprig close against his chest, feeling each quiver in the colt's trembling body. Willow pressed beside him, breath sharp and uneven. Ember hovered on her other side, pacing anxiously, but refusing to leave her flank. Behind them, the fire had begun to roar, not the scattered crackling of a forest catching flame, but the steady surge of heat, deliberately set and fed. The kind of fire Elias knew well enough to recognize as man-made. Its cadence was too confident, too controlled. Holt's men were using it like a shepherd dog, pushing life into the kill zone. Elias lifted his face toward the night air, judging the wind's direction by the way the smoke curled. The fire was climbing the ridge, but not yet descending. They had a few minutes, maybe less, before the flames reached these rocks. Enough time to move, but only if fear didn't cripple the horses. He touched Willow's muzzle gently. "We're not stopping," he whispered, though his voice was hoarse with ash. Willow blinked once, slow and heavy. Her legs trembled, but her eyes stayed on him. Even with pain stitching her movements and smoke clouding her instincts, she waited for his lead. He turned toward the narrow passage descending toward the lower basin, an old wash carved by spring melt. It was tight, uneven, and slick with thin patches of ice. No truck could reach it. No engine. If they could get down to the basin floor, Elias knew they could follow the dry creek bed west, away from the flames and out of Holt's trap. But first, they had to reach it alive. He stepped into the descent. Ember followed immediately, the young foal's ears pinned back, breath puffing in nervous bursts. Willow hesitated, shifting her weight from her injured shoulder to her stronger side. Elias placed a hand on the rock wall, letting Sprig rest against his hip. "Just one step," he murmured. One step, then another. Willow found her balance. Elias moved ahead, guiding them down the ridge as smoke deepened the darkness around them. Sprig whimpered softly against his coat, its breath warm but rapid, each inhale a trembling question. Elias adjusted his grip, keeping the colt close, shielding it with his jacket. It wasn't much protection, but it was what he had. Halfway down, a tree branch cracked loudly in the distance. Ember startled, nearly losing footing. Willow braced against the stone. Elias froze. He heard it then, beneath the fire, beneath the wind. Voices. Not shouts, not panic. Instructions. "Push them south. Check the ravine. Keep your lights low." They were close. Elias pressed himself flat against the stone, urging the horses into the narrowest part of the slope. His heart pounded hard enough he feared the sound might echo through the rocks. The flashlight beams swept across the ridge above them, slicing the darkness into harsh white strips. One beam paused, hovering near the mouth of the cut they'd just passed through. If the beam dropped even a few inches lower, it would expose them instantly. Willow held still, rigid as winter cedar. Ember tucked beneath her belly. Sprig was silent in Elias's arms, as if sensing the danger as sharply as he did. The beam lingered. Too long. Elias didn't breathe. Then, mercifully, it moved away. Boots crunched overhead. Men murmured. Engines idled like patient predators behind the tree line. But the slope hid Elias and the horses from view, tucking them into nature's blind spot, a space the men with guns and headlights hadn't thought to investigate. When the voices drifted farther away, Elias moved again. The descent grew steeper near the bottom. Ember slipped once, catching itself at the last second. Willow's legs buckled, and Elias lunged forward, steadying her with his free hand. She exhaled sharply, hot breath brushing past his wrist. He saw pain flicker through her eyes, but she didn't stop moving. They reached the basin floor just as the first embers began drifting down from above, tiny red sparks that hissed softly when they touched snow. Elias glanced up. Flames licked the upper ridge, painting the sky with a pulsing orange glow. If the wind shifted, fire would spill down this slope like water. He turned west immediately. The dry creek bed wound between thick groves of willow trees and young aspens. Frogs slept beneath the iced mud. The air felt cooler here, still touched by winter. Willow and Ember moved more confidently, relieved by the level ground. Sprig shifted in his arms, lifting its head slightly, breathing more easily. For a moment, Elias allowed himself to believe they had found a pocket of safety. Then, a shadow stepped into the path. A man. Not Holt. One of his hired hands, the heavy coat, the square shoulders, the rifle slung over one arm. The man raised his head, eyes locking onto Elias and the horses behind him. Elias stopped. Willow did too, her breath stiffening in fear. The man spoke first. "Well," he drawled, "looks like we found the strays." Elias felt something inside him tighten. Not fear, not yet, but something older, deeper, rooted in a part of himself he thought had died long ago. A place that once walked into burning buildings without hesitation. A place that knew the weight of choosing whether someone lived or died. He shifted Sprig so the colt was shielded behind him, then stepped forward. "You're not taking them," Elias said. His voice was calm, not loud, not shaking, just calm. The man laughed under his breath. "Old-timer, you think you get a say?" He raised the rifle. And then the night split open. A blast of sound thundered across the clearing, deep, echoing, familiar. Not a gunshot, a siren, a fire engine's siren. Elias's breath caught. He knew that sound, knew the rhythm, knew the pitch. Another siren followed, then another. Headlights cut through the trees, not the cold white of Holt's trucks, but the strong, urgent beams of county fire crews. Red strobes lit the basin like a heartbeat. The man cursed and spun, disappearing into the shadows. Elias turned sharply toward the engines approaching from the ridge. His throat tightened, not with fear now, but with something far more complicated. Because leading the first truck, helmet reflecting the flames overhead, stepping out into the smoke-lit night, was Sam. Sam Brannock. His son. The son he hadn't seen in 15 years. Sam swept a beam across the basin, locating Elias instantly. Shock flickered across his face. Shock, and something else Elias couldn't read from this distance. Sam didn't speak. Not yet. But he moved toward his father with steady, purposeful steps, the urgency of a firefighter who had come to save lives, not just his father's, but the animals behind him. For a moment, Elias could not breathe. Fire glowed above them like a second sun. Smoke curled around the creek bed. Horses trembled with fear and exhaustion. And his son, the boy he once held the way he had held Sprig, stood just 10 yards away. Older, taller, carved by years Elias had not witnessed. The world narrowed into a single thread of sound, a single point of light. Sam said one word. "Dad?" Elias closed his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, he felt something inside him begin to break. Not from pain, but from the unbearable weight of hope. For a moment, Elias could not tell whether the roar in his ears came from the fire or from the blood rushing hard beneath his ribs. Sam stood 10 yards away, helmet in hand, smoke swirling around him like a memory Elias had buried but never escaped. The boy he had once carried on his shoulders was now a man, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, with a calmness Elias recognized too well. It was the calmness of someone who'd run toward flames instead of away from them. "Dad?" Sam repeated, softer this time, as if afraid the word might shatter something fragile between them. Elias opened his mouth, but no sound followed. The years they'd lost hung in the smoke between them. Years filled with questions, accusations, moments neither man had dared face. Willow took a slow step forward, her breath shaking from exhaustion. Ember stayed glued to her side. Sprig whimpered faintly against Elias's chest, struggling to lift its head. Sam's eyes moved from Elias to the horses, reading the scene with the trained precision of someone who'd walked into countless emergencies. His posture shifted, not as a son approaching a father, but as a rescuer, assessing a situation that didn't fit neatly into any protocol. "What happened?" he asked. Elias swallowed. The words felt knotted. "Men. They were driving the fire, pushing us down the ridge." Sam's brow furrowed. "You mean the stock company?" Elias nodded once. Sam exhaled a slow breath filled with something like disappointment, a disappointment directed not at his father, but at the world he'd spent years trying to make safer. "We've been trying to catch them for months," Sam said. "Every time we get close, they're gone before we can get a warrant." The flames surged behind them, the wind pushing heat down the slope. One of Sam's crew shouted from the ridge, "Lieutenant, fire's shifting. We need to reroute east." Sam raised a hand to signal he'd heard them, but didn't look away from Elias. For a brief moment, father and son stood in a pocket of stillness, a fragile quiet against the chaos around them. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Sam said. "I wasn't," Elias replied, glancing down at Sprig. "Not anymore?" Sam's eyes softened. For the first time in years, Elias saw a flicker of the boy he used to know, the one who ran barefoot through the meadow, the one who reached for his father's hand without hesitation. But the man standing before him now carried weight that boy never could have imagined. "We need to get them to safety," Sam said, nodding at the horses. "There's a way through the West Creek. It'll buy us time before the fire jumps." Elias hesitated. Not because he doubted Sam's knowledge. Sam knew fire better than he ever had. But because something inside him still braced for judgment, for the words he feared Sam had been carrying for 15 years. Sam stepped forward slowly, hands open, the way Elias had approached Willow in the clearing days before. As if he knew sudden movement might break something delicate. "Dad," Sam said, voice low, "we don't have to talk now, but I'm not walking away again." The words landed like a hand pressed gently to a wound that had never healed properly. Elias felt his throat tighten, but Sprig stirred weakly, reminding him the moment wasn't just about the two of them. He nodded toward the creek. "Lead the way." Sam's expression changed, something relieved, something unspoken, and he moved past Elias to guide the path. 2 other firefighters joined them, their reflective jackets glowing in the fire's orange wash. None questioned why a man was carrying a frail foal in his arms. None questioned the limping mare or the trembling young one pressed close to her. In the mountains, need was need. Life was life. As they followed Sam through the narrow passage, Ember darted ahead, sniffing the air as if sensing a direction beyond instinct. Willow stayed behind Elias, matching his steps with quiet resolve. The fire hissed behind them like a living thing, climbing branches and swallowing the ridge in a curtain of sparks. Sam slowed his pace until he walked beside Elias. For several moments they said nothing. The silence between them wasn't hostile, it was simply heavy, full of the weight of years neither had dared examine. "You look older," Sam finally said, not unkindly. "So do you," Elias replied. Sam gave a short breath of a laugh, soft, almost disbelieving. "Guess time didn't stop for either of us." Elias wanted to say something then, something about the nights he'd replayed the fire that took their family, the guilt he'd carried until it calcified into silence. But the words felt too large, too tangled. And this wasn't the moment to unravel them. Instead, he said quietly, "I'm glad you're here." Sam didn't look at him. "I came for the fire call," he said. But after a beat of silence, he added, "I'm glad I found you." The path widened as they reached the creek bed. The fire glow faded behind boulders, replaced by moonlight reflecting off thin sheets of melting ice. The air cooled, carrying the damp smell of earth and winter grass. Sprig stirred again. Elias shifted the foal in his arms, brushing his chin lightly against its head. "He's fighting," Elias murmured. Sam's gaze warmed. "So are you." They continued until they reached a small clearing shielded by rock and snowdrifts. Sam signaled to the crew, "We'll hold here until the blaze moves north." Elias set Sprig down gently onto a bed of dry grass. Willow collapsed nearby, exhausted. Ember curled against her side, chest rising and falling rapidly but steadily. Sam knelt beside Sprig, studying the colt's shallow breaths. "Dad, these horses saved you?" he asked quietly. Elias looked at his son, smoke drifting between them, moonlight catching the lines on Sam's face, lines he hadn't been there to witness forming. "No," Elias said softly. "I saved them." He paused. "And they saved me." Sam didn't answer. He didn't need to. The understanding in his expression was enough. Something fragile passed between them then, an unspoken acknowledgement that healing didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a foal breathing softly against the cold earth, or a father and son kneeling side by side for the first time in years. Sam placed a hand gently on Sprig's side. "Then we keep them safe. All of them." Elias nodded. "Together." The fire crackled far behind them, casting long shadows across the trees, but unable to reach the quiet clearing where two men knelt beside the fragile life that had brought them back together. For the first time in 15 years, Elias did not feel alone in the mountains. And for the first time in 15 years, Sam didn't look like a man carrying a question, but a man who had found part of the answer. Morning came quietly, the way it often did after a night of chaos. Soft, pale, almost embarrassed by the destruction it illuminated. A thin veil of smoke drifted low across the basin, but the worst of the fire had moved north. The danger had passed. Sam's crew had worked through the night, pushing the blaze back into safe channels, leaving the small clearing untouched. When Elias stepped into the early light, the world felt fragile, like a page turned too gently for fear the paper might tear. Sprig lay curled in a shallow nest of grass, eyes fluttering open as the sun warmed his coat. Elias knelt beside the colt, brushing a thumb gently along its jaw. Sprig lifted its head, not strong, but steady enough to hold the moment with quiet dignity. It was a look that said, "I'm still here." A look Elias hadn't seen in anyone, human or animal, in a very long time. Willow rose slowly, her injured shoulder stiff but holding. Ember nudged her side playfully, almost as if the night had never happened. The sight of them, all three alive, breathing, together, felt like something Elias wasn't sure he deserved, but was grateful to witness. Sam approached from the tree line, helmet tucked under his arm, soot streaked across his face. He looked exhausted, but when he saw Elias, a small, unmistakable ease softened his expression. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something that would someday grow into it. "You made it through the night," Sam said quietly. "So did you," Elias replied. Sam's gaze drifted to Sprig. "He's tougher than he looks." Elias nodded. "Most survivors are." A silence settled between them. Not heavy like the ones they'd shared in the past, but lighter, like both men finally had room to breathe. Sam crouched beside Sprig, letting the colt sniff his glove. Willow watched him carefully at first, then dipped her head toward him in a gesture that felt almost like trust. Sam pressed a hand gently to her muzzle. "She fought hard," Sam murmured. They all did. Another silence, softer this time. "You know," Sam said, glancing at his father, "I always wondered if you'd left because of me, because I wasn't enough to make you stay." Elias didn't flinch, not from the accusation, but from the ache of truth wrapped inside it. "I didn't leave you," he said. "I left myself. I just brought my body along." He exhaled, voice shaking in a way he didn't try to hide. "And I'm sorry you had to grow up thinking otherwise." Sam looked at him for a long moment. The fire crews shouted orders in the distance, but none of it touched this quiet clearing. Finally, Sam nodded. Not acceptance. Not absolution. But the first step toward both. "Let's get them home," Sam said. Elias looked at him, surprised. "The cabin?" Sam shook his head, scanning the ridge where faint trails of smoke still drifted. "Not yours. Not mine." He pointed west, toward the mouth of the valley. Back where they belong. It took nearly an hour to coax Willow up the slope, but Sam stayed beside her the whole time. Ember ranged ahead, trotting through patches of thawed grass. Sprig stumbled often, but Elias lifted and steadied the colt each time without complaint. The sun climbed slowly, warming the snow enough to release the scent of wet earth and winter sage. When they reached the high meadow, the world opened into a wide stretch of golden grass and distant pine. A small herd of mustangs grazed nearby, wild, free, indifferent to the humans watching them. Willow froze for a moment, ears pricked, nostrils flaring at the familiar scent of her kind. Elias stepped back, giving her room. "Go on," he whispered. Willow nuzzled Ember first, then Sprig. The small colt leaned into her with a soft, questioning sound, as if asking whether she was sure. She nudged him gently toward the herd, her breath warm against his side. Sprig took a shaky step forward, then another. Ember trotted beside him. The herd lifted their heads, watching. The lead mare stepped forward, studying the newcomers with calm, ancient wisdom. After a long moment, she turned and walked toward the ridge. Ember followed. Sprig hesitated, looked back once, one long, fragile look, and then moved after his sibling. Willow lingered. She stepped close to Elias, so close he felt her breath warm against his chest. For a heartbeat, time held still. Her eyes met his, deep, gentle, full of something older than fear and braver than gratitude. Something like understanding. Then she turned and walked after her young. Elias watched them go, the three small figures merging into the rhythm of the herd until the wind carried them out of sight. His breath hitched. It wasn't pain, and it wasn't loss. It was something gentler, a quiet acceptance that some things were meant only to pass through our lives long enough to change them. Sam stood beside him, arms folded. "You did right by them," he said softly. "Maybe," Elias answered, "but they did more for me." Sam didn't question it. He simply nodded. The mountains around them seemed to exhale, as if the land itself approved. When they turned to leave, Sam paused. "Dad," he said, voice careful, "I've been fixing up an old cabin near Sheridan. Hasn't had anyone living in it for years. Figured maybe you might want to take a look sometime." The invitation hung between them, raw, tentative, full of hope neither man dared call by name. Elias nodded slowly. "I'd like that." They walked back toward the valley side by side, not speaking, but not needing to. The silence between them was different now. Not empty, not sharp, not filled with things they couldn't say. It was a silence that allowed space for what could grow. When Elias reached the edge of the trail, he turned back one last time. Far in the distance, barely visible against the sunlit ridge, he saw a small, pale figure. Sprig, lifting its head, looking back toward him for a single, lingering heartbeat. The long look. Elias raised a hand, not to call him back, just to acknowledge the moment. Sprig turned and followed the herd into the bright, open plain. Elias let the breath he'd been holding slide out slowly. For the first time in 15 years, the world felt wide again, and he felt alive enough to walk into it. If this story touched you in any way, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Leave a simple comment below, even just a few words, and let me know what part stayed with you the most. And if you'd like to travel with me through more heartfelt stories like this, consider subscribing. There are many more journeys waiting for you.